Hello. How many of you have children that you left at home unable to go trick-or-treating with you because you had to choose between your beloved children and your friend Liz Gilbert? You made the right choice. No, I'm just kidding. I am so happy to be here. Thank you, Ann Patchett, wherever she ran off to. There she is. My dear friend, somebody who paves the way for so many women writers, a great woman and a great writer and a great bookstore owner. Thank you to Parnassus and also to the library for having me here and for all of you for coming out tonight. It's been such a delight to be on this book tour. And so some of you know I wrote this book, Eat, Pray, Love, that old thing, that some of you may have heard of. And it was really obviously a tremendous font of blessings in my life for so many reasons to have written that book, not least of all to have come into a kind of communion with readers in a way that was more intimate than anything I ever could have imagined before. But it did present a bit of a problem. Puzzle maybe is a better word than problem. Let's like take the world's problems and compare it to the problem of having written Eat, Pray, Love. Problem seems the wrong word to use here. But it was a puzzle as a writer to try to figure out what you then do. And the feeling that I had after having written Eat, Pray, Love was, it was not a feeling of paranoia because it was real and actually rational. The feeling that I had was that whatever I was going to do next would be inevitably disappointing to people. Because whatever it was, didn't matter. It was not going to be Eat, Pray, Love, which would be disappointing to people who had adored Eat, Pray, Love. And for people who hated Eat, Pray, Love, which was a lot of people, it would be really disappointing for them to know that I still lived. And so there was like nothing I could do to please, you know, and I'm somebody who genuinely likes to please and to delight and to entertain. And so it was a difficult challenge, and I felt like, you know, it's hard enough to gin up the energy to write a book, but to do it when the foregone conclusion has already been established, which is that this one's going to be pretty disappointing to people. There's a temptation to just maybe move to the Cotswolds and raise corgis and delphiniums for the rest of your life and maybe just not do it anymore. But had I done that, I would have left behind the work that has given my life meaning and has sewed together everything in my life. And that would be really tragic for me, not for the world, but for me. So I pushed through and I wrote Committed. And the day that it was published, it did feel like I was lowering a puppy into a chum pool. You know, just like, okay, there you go, there you go. And I kind of went like this and just let whatever was going to happen, happen. And then when it was over, and that sort of spell had been broken, what followed was the most euphoric, creative sense of expansive freedom I have ever experienced in my life. The sense that nothing was owed, that debts had been paid, that nothing was expected, you know, that nobody was thinking about me, that the magic bubble had been popped, and that I could then do really whatever I wanted. And what I felt that I wanted to do in that big void that opened up was to write the most ambitious novel that I could possibly come up with. I wanted to write something that was on the scale of the novels that I have always loved to read. A big birth-to-death epic, a novel of ideas that spans continents, that spans decades, that spans generations. And I wanted it to just feel really grand and freaking-mental. The only problem was I didn't have an idea for what it should be about. But that's incidental, right? The first thing you have to do is decide what the scope of the thing is, and then you have to find out what you can plug into there. I'm really fascinated with plants. I've become a passionate gardener recently, and I knew that whatever I was going to write was probably going to have to be about plants, or it wouldn't hold my own attention. And so I decided to write my monumental, epic moss novel, as Anne has mentioned. And what I'm going to do tonight is just read you a little tiny piece of it, because I would rather talk with you than at you. But it is a reading, so I'll just read you a little 5-minute section. And then what I really want to do is open this up and make it more of a conversation, if that is okay with everybody. But in the meantime, you have to listen to me for a few more minutes. It will not be long. Just as a bit of background, the novel is about a fictitious family of botanical-minded people named the Whitakers, who who are based on any number of actual botanical-minded people in the late 18th and 19th century who I studied in order to write this book. The father, Henry, is a poor-born lad from just outside of London, from Kew Gardens, whose father is a humble orchardman, and Henry is dissatisfied with his humble position in life, and he's searingly ambitious, and goes off in the world and becomes a great man of botany, breaks the Spanish monopoly on the quinine trade, becomes a very wealthy man, and settles in Philadelphia to essentially establish the American pharmaceutical industry. He marries along the way a very brilliant Dutch woman who is the daughter of a family of great Dutch botanists who have run the Hortus Botanicus gardens in Amsterdam forever. And so my character Alma is born to these two very remarkable, towering people. Alma herself is a girl of prodigious talents, a tremendous mind, an argumentative personality who chases questions to the ends of the earth as though the fate of nations depended on the answer, and indeed in her mind it does. She becomes a great scientist and engages with some of the most important scientific questions of the day. And so what I'm going to read to you now is a section about something that happened to our Alma in 1808 when she was a child of 8 years. And this happened on her father's estate in Philadelphia, which is the finest estate in the New World. This is the really fun thing about writing fiction. I haven't written fiction in 13 years, and I had forgotten the devilish joy that comes from saying something like, he was the wealthiest man in the New World, because I said he was the wealthiest man in the New World. And if you can plausibly make a case that Henry Whitaker in 1808 was the well, then he was, you know? And that's like the sort of joy and delight and freedom of fiction. Henry, another thing I was allowed to decide about Henry is that his years of travel in tropical and deserted places had left him with so many lingering illnesses that he could no longer travel. He was a man of ranging, rapacious appetites and could never be bored. And so he demanded that the world come to him, and he had the power and the influence to make that so. And whenever anybody interesting came through Philadelphia, he would lure them to his estate, which was called Whitaker. So Alma not only spends her life being very overeducated by her mother, being exposed to all these great botanical ideas, having the best greenhouses in the New World at their property, because I said they did, but also has some of the greatest minds in the world coming through here. So this is the Lyceum in which she is raised. And this is an event that happens in 1808 that she will later recall as having been the pinnacle of her childhood. It was late summer of 1808, and Henry Whitaker had acquired a new telescope. He had been admiring the night skies through his fine new German lenses, but he was beginning to feel like a celestial illiterate. His knowledge of the stars was a sailor's knowledge, which is not trifling, but he was not up to date on the latest findings. So when Maestro Luca Ponticelli, the brilliant Italian astronomer, came to Philadelphia to speak at the American Philosophical Society, Henry lured him up to Whitaker by hosting a ball in his honor. Ponticelli, he had heard, was a zealot for dancing, and Henry suspected, correctly, that the man could not resist a ball. This was to be the most elaborate affair the Whitakers had ever attempted. The finest of Philadelphia's caterers arrived in the early afternoon and set to assembling the elegant meringues and mixing the colorful punches. Tropical flowers that had never before been taken out of the balmy forcing houses were arranged in tableaus all over the mansion. Then suddenly an orchestra of moody strangers was milling about the ballroom, tuning their instruments and muttering complaints about the heat. Alma was scrubbed and packed into white crinolines, her coxcomb of unruly red hair forced into a satin bow nearly as large as her head. Then the guests arrived, in billows of silk and powder. It was hot. It had been hot all month, but this was the hottest day yet. Anticipating the uncomfortable weather, the Whitakers did not commence their ball until 9 o'clock, long after the sun had set, but the day's punishing heat lingered. The ballroom quickly became a greenhouse itself, steamy and damp, which the tropical plants enjoyed, but the ladies did not. The musicians suffered and perspired. The guests spilled out of doors in search of relief, lounging on the verandas, leaning against the marble statues, trying in vain to draw coolness from the stone. In an effort to slake their thirst, people drank a good deal more punch than they had perhaps intended to drink, and as a natural result, inhibitions melted away, and a general air of light-hearted giddiness took hold of everyone. The orchestra abandoned the formality of the ballroom and set up a lively racket outdoors on the wide lawn. Lamps and torches were brought outside, casting all the guests into turbulent shadows. The charming Italian astronomer attempted to teach the gentlemen of Philadelphia some wild Neapolitan dance steps, and he made his rounds with every lady, too, all of whom found him comical, daring, and thrilling. Ponticilli was supposed to have delivered a lecture that night with elaborate illustrations and calculations, explaining the elliptical paths and velocities of the planets. At some point in the course of the evening, though, this idea was discarded. What gathering in such an unruly spirit could fairly be expected to sit still for a serious scientific lecture? Alma would never know whose idea it had been, Ponticilli's or her father's, but shortly after midnight, it was decided that the famous Italian cosmological maestro would recreate a model of the universe on the great lawn of the Whitaker estate, using the guests themselves as the heavenly bodies. It would not be an exact scale model, the Italian drunkenly declaimed, but it would at least give the ladies a slight sense as to the lives of the planets and their relationships to one another. With a marvelous air of both authority and comedy, Ponticilli placed Henry Whitaker, the sun, at the center of the lawn. Then he gathered up a number of other gentlemen to serve as planets, each of whom would radiate outward from their host. To the entertainment of everyone gathered, Ponticilli attempted to choose men for those roles who most closely resembled the planets they were meant to represent. Thus, tiny Mercury was portrayed by a diminutive but dignified grain merchant from Germantown. Since Venus and Earth were bigger than Mercury, but nearly the same size as each other, Ponticilli chose for those planets a pair of brothers from Delaware, two men who were almost perfectly identical in height, girth, and complexion. Mars needed to be bigger than the grain merchant, but not quite as big as the brothers from Delaware. A prominent banker with a trim figure fit the bill. For Jupiter, Ponticilli commandeered a retired sea captain, a man of truly hilarious fatness, whose corpulent appearance in the solar system reduced the entire party to hysterical laughter. And on it went until all the planets were arranged across the lawn at the proper distance from the sun and from each other. Then Ponticilli set them into orbit around Henry, desperately trying to keep each intoxicated gentleman in his correct celestial path. Soon the ladies were clamoring to join the amusement, and so Ponticilli arranged them around the men to serve as moons, with each moon in her own narrow orbit, and Alma's mother playing the role of the Earth's moon with cool lunar perfection. The maestro then created stellar constellations in the outskirts of the lawn, concocted from the prettiest groups of unmarried belles. The orchestra struck up again, and this landscape of heavenly bodies took on the appearance of the most strange and beautiful waltz the good people of Philadelphia had ever seen. Henry, the Sun King, stood beaming at the center of it all, his hair the color of flame, while men large and small revolved around him, and women circled the men. Clusters of unmarried girls sparkled in the outermost corners of the universe, distant as unknown galaxies. Ponticilli climbed atop a high garden wall and swayed precariously there, conducting and commanding the entire tableau, crying across the night, "Stay at your velocity, men! Do not abandon your trajectory, ladies!" Alma wanted to be in it. She had never before seen anything so thrilling. She had never before been awake this late, but she had somehow been forgotten in all the merriment. She was the only child in attendance, as she had been for all of her life the only child in attendance. She ran over to the garden wall and cried up to the dangerously unstable Maestro Ponticilli, "Put me in it, sir!" The Italian peered down at her from his perch, troubling himself to try to focus his eyes. Who was this child? He might have dismissed her entirely, but then Henry bellowed from the center of the solar system, "Give the girl a place!" Ponticilli shrugged. "You're a comet," he called down to Alma, while still making a pretense of conducting the universe with one waving, drunken arm. "What does a comet do, sir?" she asked. "You fly about in all directions," the Italian commanded. And so she did. She propelled herself into the midst of the planets, ducking and swiveling through everyone's orbits, scuttling and twirling, the ribbon unfurling from her hair. Whenever she neared her father, he would cry, "Not so close to me, Alma, you'll burn to cinders," and he would push her away from his fiery, combustible self, impelling her to run in another direction. Astonishingly, at some point, a sputtering torch was thrust into her hands. Alma did not see who had given it to her. She had never before been entrusted with fire. The torch spit sparks and sent chunks of flaming tar spinning into the air behind her as she bolted across the cosmos, the only body in the heavens who was not held to a strict elliptical path. Nobody stopped her. She was a comet. She did not know that she was not flying. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. So then, who has questions for the answers I have prepared? As Henry Kissinger once said to a room full of reporters, I love. If you put your hand up, I will hear you, because I have good ears. Well, I won't hear you until you speak. If you put your hand up, I will read your mind, and then I will relay your question into this microphone for everybody's entertainment, and then I will answer it. No? Well, good night. Thank you. Oh, go ahead. Uh-huh.
You wanted to write this wonderful novel, but you didn't have an idea, so I wondered about the generation of that idea, where it came from, and how long you worked on this book.
Thank you. The question was, I didn't have, I had the scope of the novel, but I didn't have the idea, and where does that come from, and how long does that take to work? It's a funny thing, hunting an idea. You know, you can't go after it with a Panzer division of tanks, right? You have to. It's butterfly hunting, really. You have to come into this particular state of readiness and openness and awareness to just let whoever distributes ideas know that you are ready to catch one if it should fly by you, and that you're not going to miss it. And I had a sense that I wanted to write something about plants, but I didn't really know exactly in what direction. And the real moment of inception was that I went home to help my mom pack up some stuff in the house that my parents had lived in for 45 years. And I was doing that thing with her that you do where you've got the boxes and you have the one that goes to the Salvation Army and the one that goes to this cousin and these things that get passed along in the trash, and this goes to the new house. And we were doing the books, and we were chatting. I had my back to her, and all of a sudden I heard her gasp and say, "Oh my God, look what you did." And I turned around and saw that she was holding this book that was very familiar to me because it had been in the house the whole time I was growing up. It is a 1784 very rare edition of Captain Cook's Voyages that was published in London that my great-grandfather collected because he was not just a bully and an alcoholic. He was also an avid reader and a great book collector, and somehow he had gotten his hands on this book probably around 1919. And it was a book that it's about this big and bound in calfskin and filled with amazing illustrations of Captain Cook's voyages and maps and botanical drawings and ethnographic sketches and all sorts of really remarkable Age of Enlightenment stuff. The book was intimately familiar with me because we were forbidden to touch it when I was a child, and so we touched it constantly. And my sister and I were always making up plays and stories, and we always used it because it was the biggest and most impressive book in the house, so we used it whenever we had a sorcerer who needed a spell or something, would whip open the Captain Cook book. So anyway, she had pulled it off the shelf and opened it to see if there was anything in it, and then discovered that I, looking like maybe age 3 or 4, had scrawled my name in the end papers of this book, thereby simultaneously destroying its value and laying claim to it. And she said, "Well, you ruined it. I guess it's yours." And she handed it to me. And it's probably because of the talismanic power that this book had had over me as a child. When she gave it to me, I got that thing up the arms, you know, which is usually a signal that you should pay attention. And if you're a creative person or if you're a writer, it is actually your obligation to follow up on that shiver that went up the arms and figure out why that happened. So I took the book home and started studying it and discovered Sir Joseph Banks, who was Captain Cook's chief botanist and head of science, who went with him on the first voyage and was a tremendous botanist who brought back to Kew Gardens, I think, 7,000 specimens of plants that the Western world had never before seen, and then dispatched naturalists all over the world to collect more. And then I started going, well, look, there it is. It's not going to be on that voyage, but something's coming out of that. Somebody was on that voyage. Somebody learned from Banks. Somebody became a great botanist. somebody's going to have a daughter, like, and then it just sort of starts to build from there. So about 3 years of research after that, and I was ready to go. Easy peasy. Yes?
How do you balance your tour schedule, like within personal time? And then a two-part question, like over the years, do you have like do's and don'ts and like weird requests where you're just like, okay, no?
The question was, how do I balance my tour schedule with my personal time? I love that you think I do. That's wonderful. That gives me so much credit that I don't deserve. I got to tell you, I'm going to go on a little. I have a little thing these days against the word balance, because I feel as though, as well-intentioned as that word has become, in terms of what we're all supposed to be seeking in our lives, I think it has become yet one more word we use to beat ourselves up with because we haven't achieved it, right? And yet we're supposed to. And I mean, you can't open any page of any proper women's magazine without seeing the word balance on the page, and often on the cover, and usually from the movie star talking about how she got it. And the reality is, I don't know anybody. I don't know if I would be friends with anybody who is living a balanced life. I don't know who that would be. Do you really want to even like confide anything in that person? Like, it just seems like that would be a really kind of awful person. But I want to be friends with people who want that, you know. But and I feel like it's just another thing we use to wound ourselves. And so I've sort of let go of that a little bit and recognized that it's also so fleeting, right? We live in a crazy, shifting, weird, it's a weird planet to live on. And the minute that you've achieved balance, the ground under your feet shifts, right? And then you've lost it, and then you kind of get it back, and then you've lost it, and you kind of get it back. But in answer to your question, how do I balance it on tour? Naps and tears help a lot, and visiting dear friends along the way, and also just having learned over the years how to do it. And gratitude helps, you know, because you get sort of petulant and surly about the airport and the hotel, and then you remember that you have the very best job that any human being could have, and that you are so lucky, and you're so lucky to be published, and you're so lucky that anybody wants to come out on a Friday night and spend time with you, and that everybody else's life is harder than yours, and then you shut up and you just go do it. And then it becomes joyful. And the second question was about what? About do I ever turn down things? Oh, I'm great at boundaries. I'm not great at boundaries. I'm kidding. I so thought that was going to be a laugh line. I thought you guys knew me. I thought you knew me well enough to know that. What? No, I don't have any boundaries. I'm the permeable membrane. I don't know. I let the, you know. I'm a little better at it, but I have. I don't know. I have learned one important thing, which is that I think you sort of get to a point in your life where you think. I have to learn how to say no to things I don't want to do. And that's a big mature moment when you start to begin to do that. But the bigger mature moment is when you learn how to say no to things you do want to do, because you know that you just don't have time, or you don't have energy, or there just isn't, you know, you have to sort of triage your life and there just isn't an opportunity. And that only came to me very recently, that sometimes you have to turn down even the wonderful things in order to take care of your health, or to take care of what you truly, truly, truly care about, not just what you truly care about. So that's helped a little bit, but not much. I have very, very, very messy borders. It is. I've got Republicans who live inside me who want to build a wall, and I'm not. And I've got people sneaking across the desert all the time. Yes. Sure. The difference in process for me, nonfiction versus fiction, creatively and personally, I gotta say I don't see a huge difference, really. I kind of feel like it's just a little bit different aspect of the job. I think it's because I worked as a journalist for a long time at the same time that I was learning how to write short stories. So in my 20s, I got used to the idea that you put on this hat and you do this job, and you put on this hat and you do that job. I think there's nothing, Anne writes about this in her new beautiful book, which is, please do not neglect to buy This is the Story of a Happy Marriage. It is wonderful. But she writes about how there's almost nothing better than working in the magazine world to parboil your skills as a writer and to get you almost to lose the romance of it and to just get the job done, because it's got to get done, whatever the job might be. One thing is that I was really intimidated because I didn't have a terrific experience writing my last and first novel, Stern Men. And I think that in my mind I had sort of established that writing a novel is a painful and bloody and exhausting and terrifying thing. But I think writing that novel was because it was my first novel and I was only 27 and I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't know how to do it. And what I learned when I returned to the form is that in those 13 years, I have really learned a lot about writing and a lot about working. And the main thing that I've learned is that the more assistance you can give yourself in terms of preparation, the easier time you're going to have of it once you get to work, which is why my process is so front-loaded with research and preparation, which other people might think of as really boring, but I think of as the difference between painting the interior of a house, just walking into the living room one day and starting to paint the wall and then being like, oh, there's a picture here I have to move. Oh, the couch is in the way. Oh, everything's filthy. I didn't really choose the paint right. Or spending a month emptying the house out, polishing, getting rid of all the rust spots, taping up all the window panes, coming in with a color expert to work on what and then when the moment comes to work, you just rolling the paint on the walls because all the hard work is the preparation. So I think that's always how I'm going to write, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And then I feel when I'm writing it, I take notes on index cards, and I keep index cards in shoe boxes because it's very tactile, and I'm able to, and I do this for fiction or nonfiction, and I'm able to move them around. I've got them filed by character, by chapter, by, in this book, orchids, moss, abolition, missionaries, Tahiti, Holland, it's all sort of lined up, and then you can spread them out and look at them and then kind of put them in the right order, and then it's paint by numbers. You just write your way through the box. And so once you've sort of learned how to help yourself out, I have these wonderful moments as I'm writing where I just say, thank you, past Liz, Thank you so much for taking 2 weeks to learn about whaling roots. That's going to make this chapter a lot easier. Thank you 2 years ago, Liz, for bothering to call the guy who's the expert in botanical pharmaceuticals in historical Philadelphia, because now we actually just get to write this scene and we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So it's kind of boring. It doesn't make for a romantic image of the work. It would make for a terrible biopic. There are no fugue states. I could no more write at 3 o'clock in the morning drunk than I could do anything else at 3 o'clock in the morning drunk. It's very orderly, it's very disciplined. There are moments of course there are moments of divine inspiration, but I think that I've tried to figure out how to put this metaphor, but I feel like divine inspiration is to a lifetime of committed creativity what a one-night stand is to a 40-year marriage. Exciting, dangerous, fleeting, versus, respectful, loving, devotional, disciplined, and dedicated. And that's really where the work gets done, is in the 40-year marriage part. Yes, sir?
What you read.
Are you going to ask me about one-night stand? No, I'm not answering that question. Go ahead.
What you read, which I really think was really, really good.
Ah, thank you.
Was that a day, a half a day, and at the end of that, did you read it out loud after you wrote it? And did you call it a day after you wrote that?
I am so glad you asked that, just that one section. It's hard for me to determine. I kind of balk when people ask me how long it takes to write certain things, because I include the entire process. So I remember reading a book that mentioned that Keats once mentioned that when he was a child, he went to a party where they recreated the heavens on the lawn. And then I spent probably 3 weeks trying to find the original reference for that, and never did. So you got to figure that into the timing. And then decided, well, I'm just going to have to make that up. And then had to go look into the proportions and distances of the heavens and all of that sort of work, and then had to decide, where the astronomer could have been from, like why Henry would. So all of that figures into it. But then that was probably a day's work to write that. And then I did read it, because here's something that is very different about this book from anything I've ever written. I'm normally a very private writer. In every other way of my life, I'm a very public person, but when I'm working, I tend to be very retiring. I've never been able to write in my home. I always have to, even when I was living in squalid walk-ups in the East Village, I wrote at the New York Public Library. Thank you, library gods, for making spaces that people can go be away from their homes around ideas. Or I wrote in coffee shops or in bus stations or someplace else. This was the first book that I ever wrote completely in my own house. And one of the reasons for that is that I'm sort of more at ease in my own house than I've ever been before. My marriage to Javier Bardem is going very well. And it's a very sweet marriage. And I did something with my husband that I'd never done before with anybody, which is after I wrote the first few pages of the novel, he came up, he's very respectful of I have an office in the attic and he never even goes near it. And he sort of hesitantly, he knew I was beginning writing that day, and he sort of tapped on the door and said, "How's it going?" And I said, "Can I read it? Can I read it to you, just the beginning?" And I've never done that. And I read it to him, and he said, "What happens next?" And so then what I did was I wrote the book to him, and every night I read it to him as I was writing it. So it was like a Victorian serialized novel, but for only one reader. So it's really intimate serialization. And he's just you want to marry the person who's your champion, and he's such a champion, and he just generally would just always say, "I think you're wonderful, and I think it's terrific." But I could notice at certain times that his eyes were kind of glassing over as he sat there with his glass of wine, and then I would just write in the margins, "Delete today's work," Get rid of those 6 pages, because he would just sort of be politely listening. And then other times he was leaning in, and other times he was emotional, and other times, so I was playing to the audience, really. And I feel like that energy is in the story, and hopefully kind of pulls it along. So yes, I did read him that, and he said it was lovely, but he also says it's lovely when I managed to tie my shoes. So, after that level, you go to a sterner critic. That's what my family members are for, is to give you the tougher answer. Uh-huh.
It kind of connects to that a little bit. I've read you talk a little bit about the editing process.
Uh-huh.
And how challenging that is to go back through and over look at that. So could you just talk about that a little bit, how that differs from the actual process of writing, and some of the personal challenges it is to go back and look at your work and try to separate from it?
Yeah, the detachment, the editing process versus the writing process. This is one of the tricky magical thinking spaces that I have to go into as a writer. And this is why the more expansive you can kind of make your mind, I think the better a time you'll have with it in most creative endeavors, because you have to hold 2 completely diverse ideas to be true at the same time. And those completely opposed ideas are, this is the most important thing in the world as you're writing it, because you have to bring that level of seriousness and reverence and devotion to the work. And then sometimes even like 1 minute later, you have to turn to, this is totally disposable. And so you have to love it and then cut it, and then love it and then cut it, and care about it and then not care about it. And you have to flip back and forth all the time between that. And it's tricky, but it's also so interesting emotionally to do. I find it's kind of a really curious emotional puzzle. I've also learned, I have kind of concentric circles of the people who there's levels of editing, and I go from kindest and gentlest to sternest and toughest, and you have to do it in that order. Be very careful not to show your work right away to the person who begins all sentences with, "May I be brutally honest?" Like generally speaking in life, like people, sometimes you're going to get more brutality than honesty from that. But you do eventually want to show it to that person, because you would rather hear it from them than from the New York Times. But not. You have to just make sure that your project has a little more callus on it before you do that. I'm also really lucky to work with a friend of mine who lives in Portland, Oregon, named Ann Connell, who is. She's not a professional copy editor, but she has the most granular eye of anybody I've ever met for catching mistakes and errors. And she's usually the first person that I send it to, because at least she cleans it up. It's like auto detailing, so that even if the car doesn't run, it's immaculate. And then I give it to other people to see if they can get the engine running. But I find that whole process, I mean, I don't find it to be anguish. Sometimes it's troubling, and sometimes but it's always more interesting than anything else. I feel like those famous bumper sticker, a bad day of fishing is still better than a good day of work. I always feel like a bad day of any part of writing is still better than a good day at anything else I ever did in my life. So, it's part of the process. And if you want to write, but you don't want to edit, it's kind of like saying, I want to have a baby, but I only like them when they're 6 months old and really cute. I don't like them when they're 3 years old. Then I'm going to send them out to foster care. Like you have to take care of the project at every single step, even through the difficult times. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about, that separation. Do you ever feel like you get stuck in, like, either Eat, Pray, Love, or, like, whatever novel is out where, like, every time you meet somebody, they're like, tell me about Eat, Pray, Love, and you're like, I'm moving, I'm still developing and growing?
Well, thank you for assuming that I'm developing and growing. I appreciate that. The question was about being stuck in the way people see you. You know what? I don't think it's the world's responsibility to keep track of who I am. I think it's my responsibility to keep track of who I am. And I think I'm also a little bit sympathetic to the phenomenon that Anne was talking about earlier, about people kind of conveniently sort of sticking a label on you and saying you're this person. Because the fact is, we are all overloaded with so much information and so much media and so many people we have to keep track of, and so many people making music and art and movies and television programs, and it's really easy and efficient to just sort of catalog them. And I do it. I do it and then I get shamed. I do it because I've decided something about something and somebody, and then I am completely surprised to discover that, oh, who knew? Also can do this, and I would never have thought of that. But who has time, to keep track of everybody's backstory? So I don't mind at all, and I also don't. It's interesting for me to read some of the reviews. Have been really amusing to me about this book, because I find it interesting to see just how far the reviewer needs to separate him or herself from Eat, Pray, Love. Like sometimes the really confident ones don't even need to mention it. They just talk about this book on its own merits. But the other ones just need to take sometimes a few sentences, sometimes a few paragraphs, to make glaringly clear that they absolutely disapprove of Eat, Pray, Love, just to establish their own intellectual credibility, like just to make sure I hate books by women about confessional emotions. We're all clear, but this is a really good book, and they have to lay down the law on that really hard. And I'm like, dude, what's it to you? Like, we're not, I find that kind of amazing. And I think, are you afraid you're going to catch it? Like it's something you're going to get contaminated by. You have to make sure that you're not contaminated by it, or that your opinions are not contaminated by it. I find that really strange, but that's their jam, whatever their thing is. And I don't think it's the really best use of my energies to try to go out in the world and convince people that I am other than what they think I am. I think the really good use of my energies is to make sure that I'm always doing the most ambitious, creative work that I can do. And then whatever comes of it is kind of none of your business after that. I mean, not none of your business. That sounded aggressive. None of one's business. Just you kind of have to let it go. Uh-huh. Eustace Conway is not reserved. Eustace Conway is incredibly tyrannically domineering, so it was difficult for a different way. The question was about the book The Last American Man, which was a biography, sort of contemplation that I wrote about this very fascinating guy named Eustace Conway, who ran off into the mountains when he was about 17 years old and has lived off the land ever since, but also wants to be a charismatic prophet, and also kind of is a charismatic prophet, and also kind of is like, what's the opposite of that? Kind of is a snake oil salesman, and also kind of is a dangerous person, and also kind of is an exciting person. So I was trying to sort of sort out what he was and also what he says about manhood in America. Working with Eustace is tricky because he's one of these people who's accustomed to being the best at everything and in control of everything. And so the only way I could figure out how to do it, and I don't think this is typically how these things are done. Also, he didn't come to me and say, will you write a book about me? And it wasn't like a ghostwriting relationship. I approached him, having written a magazine article about him, and said, I want to write a book about you. Will you work with me? Will you cooperate with me? And he immediately started trying to kind of micromanage how that was going to go. And I just said, you know what, Eustace, here's what the terms are going to have to be. We'll split the money, 50-50. And what I'm buying from you by giving you half the money for my work for 4 years is total control over this project. And if that's not something that you're comfortable with, then we just can't do it, because I have to do this. And you should be paid and compensated for the fact that you're sharing your life story and you're giving me your time, but I'm running this, I'm driving this bus, you know? And every once in a while during the process, I would have to sort of gently lean over and take him by the arm and say, you're the mountain man, I'm the writer. I don't tell you how to skin a deer, you know? You're not gonna tell me how to do this. And he was very happy, I mean, he was very courageous about sharing himself in a really intimate way. He gave me such access to his life. He gave me boxes of youthful diaries and journals that he himself had not opened in 20 years. I cannot imagine ever doing that for anybody. In fact, I feel like right now going home and burning those in case anybody should ever read them. He gave me love letters. He gave me phone numbers of women who he knew hated him, whose hearts he had broken, and said, you should call her and talk to her, she hates me. You know, he's a full-on person, and he's sort of committed. If we're going to do this, we're going to do this full-on. And one of the things that that did for me was inspire me to be as open as I could when I wrote Eat, Pray, Love, because I thought, if you're ever going to ask somebody to be that revealing, then it's sort of not fair if you don't then do the same. So we're still friends. You know, there's boundaries that have had to be established, but he's somebody that I care about. He's somebody who I worry about sometimes, pity sometimes. I think he's a very lonely and unhappy person. He's like a lot of us, like most of us, he's playing the same song over and over again. This song always comes to the same ending. It's just sort of one sad ending after another in his life. I wish he would be different, but you know, the beginning of sanity is to stop being shocked and appalled when people that you know behave exactly like themselves, again and again and again, because that's what they're going to keep doing. So it worked out. It worked out well. I think we got through it without tears, and as being two people who can hang out together, which I think is kind of the best you can do in that situation. Yes?
I read somewhere that you had read the novel Wolf Hall.
Thank you. Has anybody here read Wolf Hall? Yes, you have. The Booker Prize-winning, stupendous historical novel by Hilary Mantel. In my opinion, it's the best book of the last 10, 20, 50 years. I mean, it really got me. And she wrote about Henry VIII, and more particularly about Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's sinister but incredibly compelling in her telling advisor. And I had already begun researching the novel and sort of laying the novel out, but it wasn't until I read Wolf Hall that I got the trick of what you could do, because I didn't know, I wanted to write a book that took place in the 19th century. I didn't want it to feel candlesticky, is the only word I can come up with for a certain sort of tone that historical novels can take sometimes. I didn't want the candlesticky feel. I didn't want to pretend I was writing a lost George Eliot novel. I didn't think I could get away with that, first of all. And I also thought that that would be really affected. And then I read Wolf Hall and realized she wrote a contemporary novel that just happened to be set in the 16th century. And that was just this tiny little psychological shift for me to realize that I can write this from my position in 2012. I just happened to be writing about the events that occurred in this era. As long as I don't use any anachronistic language, I can use a contemporary soul to tell this story. And that opened up the whole thing. But I had to read it twice before I got that, because I kept trying to decode the magic of what she had done. And I think that's the magic of what she did. Thanks for your question. Did you read Bring Up the Bodies? Oh, yeah. I do too. But what I really love about her as well, Hilary Mantel, I love her confidence. I love her confidence as a narrator. That's what I love about 19th century literature, is the very self-assured narrator who just takes you by the hand and says, come along, come on, come on. I know exactly where we're going. I've got this whole thing figured out. I am not going to drive the carriage off a cliff. You know, like, we are going on an adventure. And I also love her confidence as a writer. She won the Booker Prize, you know, twice for the book and the sequel. It's like Godfather 1 and 2 getting the Oscar. And then at the Booker Prize ceremony, of course, the obvious question people asked her was, do you feel a lot of pressure about the third one? And she was like, oh no, the third one's great. It's going to be great. You know, like just, she's like, I got this. I know what I'm doing. I know how to do my job. It was so cool to see somebody just blatantly just saying, like, owning her capacity. I think that's really amazing and inspiring. Yes, back there?
So you alluded to the negative reaction to Eat, Pray, Love.
Mm-hmm.
I would be on the opposite end, by the way.
Thank you.
But what do you think that's about? And how do you see it playing out with Sheryl Sandberg and
Right.
a lot of other women who write in that personal tone?
Yeah.
What's your reflection on what that's about, and are you going to do it again?
Why the haters? Is that the question? Why the Eat, Pray, Love haters? I think there are as many reasons for that as there are haters. I think people bring their own particular breed of hate to stuff that they hate. I think some of it is just kind of fear of women and fear of women's feelings. Some of it is anger at what was perceived to be self-indulgence. Some of it, my dear friends, of course, always say that it's jealousy. But I don't think that everybody who hated Eat, Pray, Love was jealous of it. I think some people legitimately just hated it. And I think that you have to respect that. Like, you have to just, you know, there's stuff I hate that I'm not jealous of. I just don't like it. And I think that you just have to give room for that and allow that. It's not always intimate or emotional or politicized in that way. I think the other thing that happens is that when a book reaches a level of, not just a book, anything, but let's just say a book reaches that level of visibility, suddenly it becomes this giant screen upon which people start flinging their, projecting their most powerful emotions about a lot of other stuff that really has nothing to do with the book, and has everything to do with whatever is going on in the zeitgeist at that moment or in their own lives at that moment. And the other thing that happens is that when something gets that much attention and everyone's talking about it, then suddenly you feel sort of obliged to read it, which means that the book ends up in the hands of a bunch of people it was never intended for. And that happens to me sometimes, where there's a book that's just like, everyone's reading this book. And so I just feel like I would be remiss not to read it. And then I read it and I hate it. And I was like, but you never would have read, that's not a kind of book you would ever read. It's not fair to that author to then say it's not well written because I felt like I had to participate in some conversation that was going on in the culture. So I think that happened as well. I don't know. Have I listed all the reasons to hate? There are more. And then there's the whole chicklet thing, and what I found kind of interesting and unable to avoid noticing is that when I wrote about men and men's journeys, they gave me the National Book Award nomination. They gave me the National Book Critics Circle Award nomination. They gave me the National Magazine Award. They gave me the Penn Hemingway. They showered me with love. And when I wrote about a woman's emotional journey, they just like shunted me off into that particular dungeon of horror. And that is just kind of the way it is, I guess, still, to a certain extent. But I don't believe that there's much you can do about it other than to continue to do whatever work you want to do. And of course, there are consolations, It's sort of sad to have people hate your book, but it's kind of great to have 8 million copies of it sell, sort of makes you feel a little better. You can kind of be like, it's not so bad, that anonymous blogger was really mean. On the other hand, so when you weigh it, it's kind of like, I think I can survive this. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you still experience resistance to this craft you love at this point? And do you at this point have sort of a pre-anticipated method of attack when resistance arises?
Oh, okay, thank you. The question was, do I still have resistance to this craft, and do I have a method of attack? Okay, right there, that word is the problem. And that is why I struggled as a writer in my 20s, is because having been raised on the mother's milk of German Romanticism, as every single creative person in Western society has been, it was my misunderstanding that if you are not at war with your creativity, you're not doing it right. If you're not a bit tormented or tormenting other people around you, you're not doing it right. I had a high school English teacher who said to me when I was 14, you're a really good writer, but it's too bad you'll never have a chance to be one because you haven't suffered enough. Your life hasn't been traumatic enough, right? Jerk-off thing to say to a 14-year-old, by the way. And I thought, God, I got to do something about it. Got to go get me some suffering. And also, what does a middle-aged man know about the sufferings of a 14-year-old girl, by the way, which were acute, I can tell you, because of the fact that I was a 14-year-old girl. And what I've learned is that what I'm much more interested in is not attacking the work, but collaborating with the work. I feel like that's an older relationship that human beings have with creativity. I think that's the original relationship that human beings have with creativity. And I think it got really perverted by a bunch of guys in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, and we still have a hangover from that. And even the language that people use, I find it like I recoil from it when people say things. I mean, the famous quotes about writing, right? It's easy to write, you just open up a vein and bleed. They're always violent, right? Like, kill your darlings is another one. Norman Mailer saying well, let's just not even bring Norman Mailer into it. So off the scales in this direction. I mean, I don't think Norman Mailer would have enjoyed anything that he wasn't punching, or that he didn't feel was punching him. And I just feel like it's a general rule of the universe that anything you fight fights you back, and anything that you invite approaches. And if you want the work, you invite the work. You don't attack the work. And I also have a sort of magical thinking, mystical idea that is where I keep my one foot with the fairies, that the world is constantly being swirled by creative ideas that want very much to be made manifest and can only be made manifest through people. And they're looking for people to come through. And the same way that lightning wants the most efficient path down to the earth, they want the most efficient path into being, and they will find the person who can do it, who's like committed to doing it the most. And so when you get those little moments of inspiration, when you get those sort of tweaks of creativity, it's your obligation to get everything else out of the way, including your own garbage. And so when I'm struggling now with my work, I know that it's me. It's not it, you know? It's not because I'm being tormented by the muse. It's not because the arts are an arena of suffering and pain and blood. It's because I have a problem that I need to get out of the way. And then it's my job, just as you would with any psychological problem, to try to figure out what you need to do to clear that, right? Do I have to meditate? Do I have to pray? Do I have to go for a run? Do I have to end a toxic relationship that's distracting me? Do I have to go back and have a tune-up at the shrink? Do I, like, what is the thing that I can do to make myself as open a channel as I possibly can to that work? And what if I just trusted that the work wants to be made as much as I want it to be made, and that it's doing everything it can to come through me? And I feel sometimes like the artist in the studio sort of like throwing dishes against the wall and weeping and pulling out their hair. I feel like the little creative ideas just sort of sitting on a cot in the corner, just waiting, just kind of like, when you're done with that, can we go back to this? And I'm just gonna wait. And it just waits, and it just watches like all this spinning until the artist spins himself out, and then the idea is like, okay, let's go. Let's get back to work. And I think that the great tormented artists did their work not because of their torment, but despite it, because the creativity was so powerful in them, it came up like grass through the sidewalk. And so I try to keep that grass growing as well as possible. I don't know how else to say it, except for that it's a really big leap of trust. And I have friends who are so rational and proud atheists and who are just firm rational writers, but they have all kinds of crazy magical thinking about jinxes. I don't want to talk about the work because I don't want to jinx it. My second book's not going to be as good because you only get one good book in your life. They say all these things, and I always call them out on it. And they say, when you say that, you do know that what you're implying is that there is an operating force in the universe that's doling out reward and suffering and pain, which sounds a lot like a deity. So if you're going to do that, and you're going to sort of set up this sort of deity that's punishing you for your hubris, or setting up obstacles, or making sure that you don't get too much credit, or giving your reward to somebody else, if you're going to have irrational magical thinking, why not have irrational magical thinking in your own favor? And why not? Because it's equally irrational. My thinking is absolutely as irrational as theirs. It's just that mine is all organized with this fake belief that it's all working to help me. and that none of it is working to harm me. And I just think, why don't you just choose to think that way? Because it's just as stupid and just as crazy, but it makes the work so much easier and also makes you be able to have relationships and nice days without ruining your life and anybody else's. A modest suggestion. Yes.
Where did the notion of Alma's sexual
Passion, lustiness.
what was the inspiration for that?
Well, Alma, my character Alma is very carnal and very lusty, and I knew that that was always going to be part of her, because I wanted to write a birth-to-death woman's story, and I felt that it would be incomplete to not discuss sex, because that's part of birth. That's part of what happens in between birth and death. Hopefully, not so well. Anyway, and I also felt she's also homely, and I felt that that was important because I feel like I get really frustrated as a reader, as a woman, with books where the lusty, carnal character female is always looks like Jessica Rabbit, you know? It's always telegraphed in her appearance. She's got high color in her cheeks and a heaving breast and dangerous auburn hair and flashing eyes. And of course, she's the one who's sexualized, and the one who's pure looks pure. And it's just not real to what sex is and what desire is. And often the one who looks very lusty and sexual is probably the one who doesn't even want to be touched. And I was playing with that too in the novel by creating a pair of opposites in that regard with Alma's sister. And I wondered what it would be to write a character who is full of physical desire, and nothing in her demonstrates that. No man is ever able to pick up on that because it's just not visible. And especially in a time when it wasn't really supposed to be visible anyway. It's not even obliquely visible in her. And the tricky thing is that I also knew that she would be a self-pleasuring person, that would be a character point in her, and it would go through the whole novel. And a lot of the subsequent events in the novel are based on her desire and her thwarted desire. That's a really huge part of what drives the story. But when it came time for me to write the first scene of Alma and her self-discovery, to put it modestly, I balked. It was really the hardest thing in the book. I really got stuck, really stuck for the first time. And I had grown so fond of her, I didn't want to disgrace her. But I also knew if I took that piece out, that's the foundation, the rest of the house would collapse. So I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And what I ended up doing, you should always find an expert. So I have a friend who's a romance novelist. She writes Regency romances. And she's also a brilliant Ivy League historian who is a full tenured professor. By day and by night writes bodice ripping. And actually one of my favorite stories about her is that she did this because she was making no money as an academic and she had 2 kids and it was very easy for her to do. And she started making a great deal of money under her pen name. And for 15 years, she hid this from her colleagues at her esteemed university because she knew she would never get tenure if they knew what she was doing by night. And then at her tenure party, she brought cases of her romance novels and just handed them out to everybody. And she introduced her alter ego. And she said it was so funny because she'd been in bookstores with her colleagues where they had, like, she was appearing, and they would have a big poster with her photograph. And she said, I'd be standing kind of next to it. And she said, the only way they didn't notice is that I wear glasses and my romance novelist doesn't. So it's exactly like Clark Kent and Superman. Like, they look exactly alike. You just take off the glasses. And she said, and also because the people who I'm colleagues with are blind to that kind of a book. It was just invisible to them. Anyway, I took her out to lunch, and I just said, how do I get through this? What's the right way? And she gave me, well, first of all, I should say one of my favorite details about her is that her book contracts stipulate that she is required to write 2.5 sex scenes per book. Because the particular brand that she writes for, that's what they're, like every brand has its different kind of sex and how much sex, and her brand is 2.5. I'm gonna leave it to you guys to try to imagine what the half is. And they have to be separated. The first has to be on page 40, and the second has to be on page 80, and the third has to be on page 120. And that is how you do that kind of genre book. I think it's, and she churns out like 3 of these things a year. And so she said to me, it's actually very, very simple. You know already who your character is, I believe. You feel like she's in you and you know who she is. You just have to ask yourself what she would actually do in that situation, and then you have to permit her to do it. And I felt so embarrassed that after 25 years of writing, nobody had ever given me that incredibly useful character advice for just about anything that your characters are doing. And once I asked myself that, the answer was very clear. There's no way she's leaving herself unexplored. She's an explorer. She's going in there. So I just had to let her do it. And then once I sort of let her do it, as I believed she would, I felt that it became plausible. Yes? Is this one more? One more question, please. Yes?
I've never actually read Eat, Pray, Love. I've listened to the audiobook 4 times.
Oh, that's nice.
How does that
We've spent a lot of time together, you and I.
So how is that process different, you telling the story after you've written it?
I read Eat, Pray, Love, and I read Committed. And Anne and I were just discussing this today also, that I didn't know she has the same policy. We both read our nonfiction, but we don't read our fiction. Because the fiction, in my feeling, deserves an actor, because it needs to be presented in a very different way. And if you guys get the chance, the great British actress Juliet Stevenson read The Signature of All Things. You may know her voice from all of the Jane Austen audiobooks, all of the George Eliot audiobooks. She was the voice in my head while I was writing it, and she was the only person I wanted to read it, and she did it. And it's so exquisite. It's like you're watching a 20-part BBC miniseries, because she just paints the book. Whereas with a memoir, I just had to tell the book. And also because a memoir is my voice, I felt that it was appropriate that it be my voice. And it would be actually kind of really weird if it wasn't. It's a funny thing to sit in a tiny little booth for 10 days and just read out loud your own story to yourself. And I find it very amusing. There would be certain passages that I would just stumble and stumble and stumble over, and then I would be like, who wrote this garbage? Like have a little sympathy for the person. That's an unreadable sentence that was just... And it's also funny because I speak out loud while I'm writing, which is another reason I kind of have to be alone. I do have to be alone when I write, because I feel like my ear is better than my eye. I hear things when I hear my voice in the room that I can't see on the page. I'll hear that I used the word also 7 times. I won't see it. My eye will jump over it, but my voice won't jump over it, and my ear will catch it. So the other thing that happens in the recording booth is, of course, when you're reading it with that deliberation, you find so much stuff that you're like, oh, God, and it's too late because it's already in print. But I kind of enjoyed doing it, and it's been very sweet for me to hear people talk about keeping that with them. I have certain people's voices who are comforting voices in my head. Juliet Stevenson is one of them. I often fall asleep to her reading Great Expectations. It's one of my favorite bedtime stories, and my iPhone. And the great Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron is another one whose audio tapes I listen to, and she's sort of been associated with a certain kind of comfort and encouragement for me. And I've had people tell me that they've put Eat, Pray, Love in their ears when they're going to bed at night, and that it's brought them comfort and encouragement. And that makes me feel really pleased and honored, because, you know, we're all in the same emergency room here. And if we can offer each other comfort and encouragement along the way, then we've done good. So thank you all so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.